The golden lava finally ate through enough of the buzz for Ginny to dart out of the cage. The girl smiled widely as she plunged her hands into the ravine of magic that was her core. Her consciousness seemed to regain a glow of health she had been missing without Rigel realizing it. "I've missed this," Ginny said reverently. "I could accept that bastard possessing me, I let him into my head, after all, but taking my magic away, I think I will always hate him for that." "Time for hate after we get rid of him," Rigel said, though she agreed that such a thing went beyond intrusive and into a realm of perverse cruelty that she could scarcely imagine. "Can you cleanse your magic of his taint?" Ginny furrowed her brow, concentrating on her core. "It runs so deep, but it's my magic." Her voice firmed and her eyes flashed. "I'll burn the bastard out." Rigel stepped back a bit as the molten liquid in the fissure moved from a simmer to a roiling boil. The heat in Ginny's mindscape increased dramatically, the fires dancing along the surface of the liquid blazing hotter and brighter and higher. The holes that littered the ground all erupted with fire, and small streams of molten gold bubbled out of them, coating the ground with golden lava. Rigel realized that the fissure in the earth of Ginny's mind wasn't the entire core, merely a small facet of it. The core seemed to stretch far beyond what Rigel had assumed, with all the little geysers connected to it, letting off bursts of power to release the tension of so much power. The golden liquid in the fissure turned white hot, and when Ginny stepped back a few minutes later, panting, Rigel couldn't see a trace of black sludge anywhere within it. "I think I did it," Ginny panted. "He won't have my magic to work with anymore." Rigel nodded. "I'm going back to my mind, then. The construct shouldn't be able to trap me there without your magic, and it'll have no defense when I push it out. I'll make sure all the spells he was using my magic for are stopped," Ginny said, "so you can use your magic again." "Thank you," Rigel said. She thought the spells would already have stopped, since the construct would no longer be in control of them, but it didn't hurt to be sure. Going back through Ginny's core was much easier than coming in. There was nothing but hot gold to push through, and within minutes she was back in her own mind. The space room, she was relieved to note, had not been penetrated. There was a chance that the construct would find it before he'd lost the use of Ginny's magic, and the room would probably not withstand the force of a magical attack, but it was a calculated risk. With no time to lose, Rigel opened the door to her space room, intent on seeking out the construct and taking the intruder by surprise. To her alarm, she found him standing just on the other side of the door, as though he had been waiting there to ambush her. But no, he looked equally shocked to see her. Rigel didn't waste time wondering why he would be surprised, though a part of her wondered what else he was doing there, if not waiting for her to open the door after realizing he could not open it himself. Instead, Rigel thrust her hand out and willed her magic forward. Her sun pulsed at her back and fire erupted from her palm. It hit the construct square in the chest, sending him flying backwards down the tunnel. Rigel spared a moment to shut the door to her space room behind her, just in case, and then ran toward where the construct was laying, stunned, on the tunnel floor. She threw another burst of flame at it, but Riddle's construct rolled and scrambled quickly to its feet. It darted to the side and ran down the tunnel, toward the trapdoor. Rigel ran after it, sending fire ahead of her to lap at the construct's heels. She chased it up through the trapdoor, through the cave lab, and out over the mountain top. The construct threw her a furious look over its shoulder as it dived into the mist, and Rigel responded with one last burst of flame to hurry its departure. She breathed a sigh of relief when it was over. She would check on Ginny to make sure the redhead had succeeded in keeping the construct out of her mind, not that she should have had any trouble, as Riddle's construct was essentially powerless without access to magic. Then they would get out of the chamber as quickly as possible. Rigel came back to her body, and was pleased to find that she could move freely once more. Her magic was humming in her veins like an angry beehive, annoyed at having been restrained by Riddle Jr.'s spell for so long. "Is that you, Rigel?" Ginny said warily once she'd opened her eyes and stretched. The 11-year-old looked shaken, but otherwise in possession of all her faculties. "It's me," Rigel said. "I drove the construct out." "Did it try to enter your mind?" "No," Ginny said slowly, "I didn't sense anything after you left." "Can you prove you're you, and not possessed by Tom?" "Well, anything I know it would have access to through my memories if it had possessed me," Rigel pointed out uncertainly. Ginny nodded. "He'd have to sort through them first, though, and I don't think he's had enough time to assimilate all the details." What instrument was George playing in the hospital wing when you came to visit me? A tiny piano, Rigel said quickly, and I think he had a kick drum as well. Ginny nodded. Okay, so, now what? We get out of here, Rigel said. I'm sure the professors are worried. She and Ginny both froze as an ominous rasping noise echoed around the hall. It came again, the sound of something heavy shifting clumsily. Rigel and Ginny whipped around to stare in horror at the basilisk, which had been lying prostrate on the chamber floor just moments before. Now, it was moving. I thought you said Tom killed it, Ginny said quietly, stepping closer to Rigel with a fearful look on her face. It is dead, Rigel said, her voice thick with fear and disgust. I think the construct didn't try to possess you because it didn't have the magic to penetrate a conscious mind. Tom's possessed the basilisk, Ginny gasped softly. Oh, Godric. They watched, frozen and wary, as the basilisk's corpse twisted slowly against the stone. Its movements were jerky, and Rigel wondered if Riddle's construct was having a hard time grasping the controls in the basilisk's mind, which was surely different from a human's. They had a small window, Rigel realized, and they were wasting it. Ginny, she said, do you remember the way to the passage that takes you back to the bathroom? Ginny nodded. I was aware enough to mark it, the last time. You want to make a run for it? Rigel shook her head. The basilisk will be too fast, even dead. It'll overtake us unless it's distracted. I'll keep it busy. You need to go. Run as fast as you can back to the passage and find help. Ginny's face tightened. I can't open the passage. I know it's open, but I can't remember how to say it anymore. Repeat after me, Rigel said quickly, taking Ginny's arm and leading her quickly towards the corridor that would take her out. Open. Oh, open. Again Rigel said. Open. Ginny said firmly, open. Open. Okay, I've got it. Rigel, be careful. The eyes. Rigel shook her head. The basilisk's magic died with it. Its eyes are just eyes now. I've only got to worry about the teeth. Go, Ginny. Quickly. Ginny took off at a run, and Rigel turned back to face the beast. It was disgusting to watch the corpse rise slowly from the ground. The wounds in its tail must be hindering the construct's control of its movements, because it trembled and shook as its body rose into the air. Gone was the grace the snake had previously possessed. Its form was almost drunken, listing sharply sideways every now and then, only to jerk back just as sharply without warning. Rigel moved away from the chamber exit, getting as far away from the basilisk as she could without backing herself into a corner. Every instinct in her was screaming to run, as fast and as far as she could, in the opposite direction, but she stayed, because Ginny was running for her. She would get the professors, and they would come and destroy the basilisk. All she needed to do was distract Riddle Jr. for 10-15 minutes at the most. The basilisk's great head began turning side to side. Rigel deliberately kicked a loose stone, which caused a sharp, scuttling noise as it skidded across the ground. The basilisk's head jerked toward her, and its mouth parted to release its long tongue, which was still stained with the snake's own blood from where it had torn chunks from its own hide earlier. To Rigel's immense distaste, Riddle's construct appeared to have garnered control over the basilisk's voice pipe, as it hissed, "Not running, little snake. Brave, for a boy so young. Foolish, too. It doesn't take much bravery to stand up to a relic like you, trapped in the skin of a dead snake," Rigel answered. Now was not the time to be the patient, accommodating hostage. Now was the time to enrage the enemy to distraction, theoretically either luring him to rash action or preventing rational action. "You dare!" The basilisk tossed its head back in outrage. "I will silence that silver tongue of yours, and then we will see how much bravery you can muster." The body of the basilisk lurched forward, sliding quickly, though grotesquely, across the floor. Rigel dove to the side, and began running toward the other side of the chamber, thankful beyond measure that she was relatively in shape, even despite a couple of months without her regular exercises. The basilisk lunged after her, but appeared to have trouble changing directions so suddenly. It lost its balance halfway through the turn and rolled awkwardly into the wall before regaining its equilibrium and starting toward her again. The key, then, would be to wait as long as possible before darting out of the snake's path, which was admittedly easier said than done in cumbersome school robes. Rigel thanked the stars she had stolen her name from, that Riddle Jr. had killed the basilisk before trying to possess her. The construct's arrogance and cruelty had together engineered her only chance at survival. She dodged the basilisk twice more before her luck ran out. When she attempted to dart past the snake a fourth time, the basilisk's tail came around suddenly and slammed into her side, sending her sprawling across the stones. Rigel scrambled to her feet, or tried to, but it felt like one of her ribs had been bruised or cracked by the blow, and her muscles spasmed in protest as she pressed her arms against the floor for leverage. She gasped as her breath caught in her lungs with the pain, and before she could get away the basilisk's body had encircled her. Rigel forced her body to its feet and attempted to climb quickly over one of the coils that surrounded her, but the basilisk's body contracted, and she was caught in a vice-like grip as the coils tightened around her. The scales scraped against her palms where she tried to pry herself free, but it was no use. She was caught fast, and she let out a groan of pain as the basilisk's muscles contracted around her, squeezing her chest painfully and causing her bruised rib to feel like it was grinding against its neighboring ribs with every breath. So it comes to this. Will you continue to struggle, little snake, or can you see now the pointlessness of your resistance? The basilisk hissed softly, its head swaying just above where Rigel was trapped menacingly. Rigel looked up to glare at the snake, feeling a jolt of fear as she looked into its great, yellow eyes, despite knowing they couldn't hurt her or anyone else ever again. You should have run while you had the chance, Rigel hissed back through gritted teeth. What will killing me accomplish? Killing you. Riddle's construct laughed through the basilisk's blood-stained mouth, the smell of rotten flesh so foul on its breath that Rigel gagged and turned her face away. No, boy, if I wanted to kill you, it would be a simple matter of sinking Thess fangs into your flesh. I will possess you if it is the last thing I do. It's too late for that, Rigel denied. I think not, the basilisk rasped. The history will be altered, of course. The brave black boy destroyed the basilisk and banished the memory of Lord Voldemort. They will look into my mind to make sure, Rigel said, though she was not certain they would, at that. They will see what I want them to see, Riddle's construct assured her. The coils tightened further, and Rigel had to pant shallowly to get any air at all into her lungs. She could see his plan, now. He would suffocate her until she passed out from lack of oxygen. Once her mind was unconscious, the construct would have an easy time possessing it, even without access to a magical core. Once inside, it would alter the appearance of his consciousness until it looked like Rigel did, and perhaps no one would think it odd that Rigel's mental avatar suddenly had hair that matched her outward appearance, instead of the long hair that Snape and Draco had seen before. The construct would use her body and magic as it pleased. It would go through her memories, discover her secrets, her deception. She didn't know what it would do with the information, but Archie's dreams would hang in the balance. She imagined Riddle's construct cozying up to Rigel's friends, slowly poisoning their minds until they were as twisted as it was. She imagined it using her friendship with Leo to his advantage, enjoying the internship at the guild as a way to build connections with some of the brightest minds of their age. She pictured it going home to her parents' house, holding her baby sister in its arms. It was not to be borne. Rigel did not know whether her magic could penetrate the scales of the basilisk or not. The scales were as tough as dragon hide, and if the basilisk were living, she would not stand a chance. With its death, however, the creature's natural magic would be gone. The scales were still hard, but not, Rigel thought, impervious. She called on her magic, which, while still nowhere near full strength, was happy to answer her. She imagined the shape of the shield Riddle Jr. had placed on her earlier, a skin-tight weave that would coat her entire form with magic. She summoned her strength, and broke her word to Snape remorselessly. For the first time, she thought the spell deliberately, Dipasco. The red shield flexed into being a hair's breadth away from her skin. She could feel the heat pouring off of it, and felt dark satisfaction when the smell of burning flesh met her nose. The shield was dissolving the basilisk's scales everywhere they touched her skin. The basilisk let out a wordless hiss and jerked away from her, and Rigel smirked knowing that Riddle's construct had been connected to the basilisk's nervous system, and therefore its pain registers, too. She rolled away from the basilisk while she had the chance and began running toward the place she had been bound earlier, where a weapon that might help her out of all this lay forgotten on the stones. The Dipasco shield remained in place around her skin for 10 more seconds, and then it flickered out as her magical core became drained beyond the point at which it could sustain the barrier. She kept running, ignoring the pain in her ribs and the stinging of her palms from where she'd scraped them against stone and scale. She glanced over her shoulder to gauge how quickly the basilisk had recovered. It was already speeding across the hall behind her. She faked a trip just as she reached the place where the fang rested on the floor, to throw off Riddle Jr.'s suspicion, if he was aware enough to recall dropping the fang there in the midst of his anger and pain. Using her bulky robes to cover the movement, she quickly grabbed the fang from the floor, careful not to pierce her skin against it, and hid it in her long sleeve just as something thick and ropey wrapped around her ankle from behind. It was the basilisk's tongue, and it lifted her into the air by her foot, dangling her off the ground helplessly. The basilisk's tail came up to curl around her waist and turn her right side up, freeing the basilisk's mouth. The basilisk held her up to its face, so close that its tongue brushed against her knee as it spoke. "You've had your fun, boy," the construct said, irritation leaking through the basilisk's throat, "but it is over, now. You've no magic left to." Rigel didn't give it time to finish. She brought her hand up swiftly and plunged the fang it held as deep as she could into the basilisk's right eye. The tail's grip was compromised, but Rigel latched onto the basilisk's head by grabbing one of the horn-like protrusions on its skull and twisting the fang still deeper into the basilisk's skull. She could feel the fang scrape through the back of the eye socket violently. Brain matter ripped beneath her ministrations, and she kept at it, the adrenaline in her system keeping her stomach from rebelling at the gore. She felt it the moment the brain became too damaged to support Riddle Jr.'s possession. The whole basilisk collapsed to the stone, utterly still. Rigel fell, losing her grip on the snake's skull and flailing in a vain attempt to orient herself in the air. Her ankle snapped with an audible crack when it hit the ground, and Rigel barely got an arm up to protect her head from hitting the flagstones. Her body felt paralyzed, though she knew it was probably just her muscles going into shock from the impact. She coughed harshly as her lungs fought for breath against the searing pain spreading from her rib cage. She was unable to even roll aside as the basilisk's head fell to the ground beside her, splattering her with spittle and bits of blood from its slackened, gaping jaws. She heard a voice in the air around her, though she couldn't see where it came from. "You think you have won, little snake? No, there can be no escape for you. So you have damaged the beast beyond possession, it matters not. Your own body is too damaged to remain conscious for long. Soon you will fall unconscious, and then your mind will be mine. I need only wait." Rigel cursed mentally. It was too much to hope that the construct had perished with the basilisk's mind. It must have fled when it sensed the possibility of death approaching. Her eyes blinked slowly as she fought to stay awake. She was so tired. The basilisk was staring at her out of its ruined, yellow eye. How afraid she had been of those eyes, before. Now they were useless, unable to kill with a glance. The basilisk seemed really pitiable now that she was looking at it properly. Its own fang cut from its mouth and driven into its skull through its eye. It was truly a horrific sight, and even though she knew how deadly the snake had been in life, she could not help but feel sorry for it in death. Death, Rigel's mind was telling her something about death. She knew she was going to die, though, didn't need her mind to tell her that. As soon as Riddle's construct possessed her, she was as good as, oh. Yes, she thought, of course. Death is the only answer. Her vision was turning black at the edges, but she mustered the strength to lift her left hand and reach toward the basilisk's gaping jaws. The distance was small, but it felt like ages before her hand slipped past its lipless mouth and felt around its gums gingerly. It was probably only a few seconds later when she grasped her fang at last. "Just give up, boy," Riddle's construct laughed, its voice filling the air around her. "Even if you pry it loose, you can't stab me with it. I have no form." Rigel braced her palm against the edge of the fang, and pulled her hand back sharply with all her strength. The fang sliced open her skin, and blood began welling from her palm immediately. "What are you doing?" the voice screeched suddenly. "No. No." Rigel smiled weakly. "Good luck, possessing me now," she said softly. Her hand began to shake as the poison coursed through her. "This isn't over," the construct's voice hissed directly into her ear, but a moment later it was gone. She lay there staring up at the hall ceiling, so far above her she could barely see it among the shadows. She could feel the blood flowing sluggishly out of her, thickened by the poison coursing inexorably up her veins. She wouldn't call herself content, dying amidst the smell of burnt basilisk and grimy sewage water, but she had done what she could. Her magic was out of Riddle Jr.'s reach. Her secrets were safe. Her friends and family would never be subjected to the unhinged construct's influence. She regretted not gaining her mastery before she died, of course. She regretted the complications that would arise for Archie when Archirus Black died at Hogwarts. Would he pretend to be Harry for the next 5 years anyway, to stay at AIM? Would he let Sirius mourn him, or would he confess everything? She regretted, but she was snapped from her regrets by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. Rigel, that was Ginny's voice, high and frantic, echoing across the hall. There was the sound of running, many pairs of feet, she thought vaguely, and then Ginny's face was bent over her own, followed shortly by Snape's grim features as her head of house knelt beside her prone form. She blinked up at them, and Ginny put a shaking hand to her mouth, sobbing, "He's alive. Godric, he's alive." Rigel turned her eyes to her own hand, which lay palm up on the ground, still bleeding, and grunted as best she could. Snape's eyes flicked rapidly from her hand, sliced open, to the basilisk's fang-infested mouth beside her, and put the pieces together rapidly. "He's been poisoned. Basilisk's venom." "I don't, Albus." First she heard the headmaster's voice say calmly. There was a flash of heat from somewhere to Rigel's right. She just barely saw the flash at the edges of her dimming vision. "If you would be so kind." She saw a blur of red as a bird of some kind alighted on the stone beside her. Hot liquid fell onto her palm a moment later. Phoenix, her tired mind supplied. She could already feel the pain diminishing. The bird began singing, a soft, crooning noise that brought tears unbidden to her eyes. Before she could summon the will to resist, a deep, dreamless sleep swept up to claim her. -0. HP. -0. She awoke to a rocking sensation, and it didn't take her long to realize she was being carried in someone's arms as they walked. Rigel's nose picked out the smell of aconite, among other herbs used in the potion she'd been brewing with Professor Snape what seemed like a lifetime ago, and she pried her eyelids apart to see her head of house's shoulder an inch from her nose. She blinked, and a small spot of what was probably her own drool on the fabric came into focus. That was embarrassing, she thought vaguely, and attempted to lift her head. She hissed softly as her neck voiced its objection to the movement, apparently content to remain resting against Snape's overcoat, but she was able to lull her head backwards enough to see Snape flick his eyes down at her face assessing. "We are en route to the headmaster's office," Snape informed her without being prompted. "The headmaster feels explanations are warranted at this time, despite the obvious trauma that has been inflicted upon you and Miss Weasley. If you feel unable to process things at this time, I will, of course, see you excused to the hospital wing at once." His tone indicated he meant to see her excused to the hospital wing in any case, but Rigel felt she would rather everything were over with at once. After taking stock of her body, she felt surprisingly fine. Did the Phoenix heal everything? She croaked out. Her throat was uncomfortably dusty, but her words were at least comprehensible. "One fractured rib, scraped palms, broken ankle, numerous cuts and bruises, and, oh yes, a slice made by a basilisk fang," Snape said sharply. "What were you thinking?" "Not my fault," Rigel said automatically. Snape snorted. "I very much doubt that." "How is Ginny?" Rigel asked. Right here Ginny's voice came from behind them, and the redhead moved into Rigel's line of vision accommodatingly. "I'm glad you're all right, Rigel. I thought I was too late." "You did great, Ginny," Rigel said. "Perfect timing, I think." Ginny laughed weakly. "I guess. It took me a few minutes to open the passageway. I think I wasn't putting the right inflection on the word. I already can't remember how to say it. The language slips from my mind, somehow, when I try to grasp it." That was probably for the best, Rigel reflected, as the other Slytherins probably wouldn't be happy to hear that Rigel had given a Gryffindor the override password to the common room entrance. "Thank you, in any case," Rigel said earnestly, "and thank the headmaster for the loan of his Phoenix, please." "Oh, I doubt foes would ever forgive me if I presumed to accept thanks on his behalf." Dumbledore's voice came from the hallway ahead of them, and Rigel supposed he was leading the way. "You may thank him yourself, however." With a trill, the scarlet bird alighted on Snape's shoulder and peered down into her face seriously. "Thank you, foes," she said softly. The Phoenix gave a short burst of song, which Rigel supposed meant he accepted her thanks, and fluttered his wings a bit, much to Snape's displeasure. The potions master turned his head sharply to avoid a mouthful of feathers. "Albus, tell your bird that my shoulder is not his perch," Snape said. "Tell him yourself." Dumbledore's reply was both mild and unconcerned in tone. "He doesn't listen to me," Snape grumbled under his breath. "Contrary as a cat, phoenixes are," Dumbledore agreed. "A trait they encourage in their owners as well." No doubt McGonagall's wry voice came from behind them, but Rigel couldn't see the head of Gryffindor House from her position. "Speaking of, I can walk now, Professor," she said. Snape merely lifted a brow. "When you learn better than to take on fully grown basilisks by yourself, Mr. Black, I will allow you to be the judge of what you can and cannot do." "I didn't have a choice," Rigel pointed out. "So you say." Snape did not sound terribly convinced. She heard a loud scraping noise and flinched slightly, turning her head with a monumental effort to look towards the source. "It is the passage to the headmaster's office," Snape informed her steadily. "The basilisk sounded like that," Ginny said softly. "Its scales were so hard, when it moved across the floor it was like stone scraping against itself." "You poor children," McGonagall said. Rigel wasn't sure they deserved her sympathies. She and Ginny were alive and unharmed, after all. If anything was to be pitied, she thought it ought to be the basilisk. They ascended the moving staircase and the headmaster helpfully conjured several additional chairs so that he, McGonagall, Snape, Ginny, and Rigel could all be seated comfortably in his office. Before they began the interrogation, Rigel asked, "Has someone informed my housemates that I'm all right?" "Professor Flitwick went to Slytherin House for that very purpose," Dumbledore said reassuringly. "And my brothers?" Ginny put in quickly, frowning. "They must have been so worried." McGonagall nodded, her lips quirking weakly. "Professor Sprout took care of it. I suspect Mr. Percy Weasley will be especially relieved to hear of your safe recovery." Ginny snorted. "He's probably spent all night trying to keep the other three from scouring the castle for me. Those idiots. Still, it's how they show they care." Rigel wondered if Draco had tried looking for her, but then dismissed the thought. Draco was much too intelligent to run around a castle blindly when there was nothing he could do even if he'd found her. She hadn't been missing that long, in fact. If the teachers didn't publicize her kidnapping, he might not even be too worried. "Well, now," Dumbledore said, folding his hands on top of his desk and peering at she and Ginny over his half-moon spectacles, "it's rather late, and I'm sure you two want to find your beds. If you could give us an account of what happened in the chamber, I can pass the account along to the Board of Governors, and we teachers can find our beds as well. How does that sound?" Ginny nodded slowly, a fearful look on her face. Rigel could guess what she was afraid of, being blamed for letting the construct take advantage of her mind the way it did. "I'll explain, if that's all right with you," Ginny. Rigel said, "Strange as it sounds, I think I have more of the pieces than you do, at this point." Ginny blew out a short breath. "Yes, thank you. I don't actually want to talk about it." "Where to start?" Rigel muttered, thinking. "Your movements are known until you exited my office this evening with Prefect Fairister, who is perfectly fine." "Desist with that stricken expression," Snape said. "Begin there." Rigel bit the inside of her lip, and said, "I think I ought to begin a bit further back, actually, if you want to understand why I specifically was kidnapped." Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. "My dear boy, I had assumed you were a victim of opportunity." "You mean to say you were targeted specifically?" "Yes," Rigel said. She gathered her thoughts for a moment, and then began. She would tell the truth, of course, but the truth in this case was a delicate thing. "You should know from the start that Ginny is as much a victim in this as I am. Ginny was unfortunate enough to come into contact with a dark artifact of considerable power. A book, which housed a sentient magical construct." "Where is this book?" Dumbledore said sharply. "Did you destroy it?" "No," Rigel said, "but the book isn't important anymore. Soon after meeting Ginny, the construct that lived in the book cut its ties with its container and moved into Ginny's mind. It lived there, gathering strength and slowly gaining control over Ginny's magic, until it was strong enough to possess her." McGonagall gasped and set a shaking hand on Ginny's shoulder. "And none of us suspected. I am so sorry, Miss Weasley." "I didn't know what was happening myself," Ginny said, shamefaced. "How could you have?" "The construct spoke Parseltongue," Rigel said, "and opened the Chamber of Secrets using Ginny's body." It released the basilisk that lived there and used it to petrify students. It was trying to get you removed from your post, headmaster, though its reasonings were not entirely clear. The construct seemed quite mad, by the end. I think the magic holding its personality together broke down over time. It was created some 50 years ago, I believe. The construct was very unstable, and so I am not sure how much of its ramblings were true. What do you mean? Dumbledore asked keenly. What did it tell you? Truth, Rigel reminded herself. The headmaster seemed the type to know if you were lying. It called itself Lord Voldemort, Rigel said carefully. She looked at the teachers' faces, but none seemed to recognize the name. It was power-hungry, and immensely dissatisfied with the current state of the wizarding world. It wanted to start a revolution of some kind, to change the world for the better, according to some standard known only to itself. It used Ginny to sow chaos in the school, hoping that the headmaster would be discredited, and I think it just liked making people afraid. The construct used Ginny's body to obtain belladonna, and poison Hagrid's roosters. Over time, Ginny began to realize what was happening, what was living in her head. She started to fight, and she tried to get rid of the book, thinking it to be the source. What did you do with the book? Dumbledore asked. He seemed very intent on knowing exactly where the dark artifact was. I dumped it in Moaning Myrtle's toilet, Ginny said. I figured no one would find it there, because no one ever goes into that bathroom. Myrtle is a friend of mine, Rigel said, ignoring the raised eyebrows she got for that statement. She told me about someone throwing a book at her head, and gave it to me. I didn't know what it was, but Ginny saw it in my bag at the library and recognized it immediately. I think the construct decided I was a loose end, since I had the book, so it possessed Ginny again and kidnapped me as I was on my way back from Professor Snape's laboratory. There, that included all of the facts, but left Draco and Pansy out of it entirely. Rigel wasn't sure if she would be in trouble for keeping the book despite knowing it had a connection to the petrifactions, but she could spare Draco and Pansy the interrogation their involvement would warrant, in any case. So the construct took you for a threat, Snape mused. How did you survive as long as you did in the chamber? Severus. McGonagall said, that's entirely insensitive, even for you. It's a fair question, Professor Rigel said. 2 reasons, I think. First, the construct changed his mind at some point. Instead of killing me, it decided to possess me, thinking it would be more useful to have a host who spoke Parseltongue, so it wouldn't have to hide its ability. Second, it wasn't in a hurry. It was confident that no one could break through Slytherin's wards over the chamber entrance. Well, I dare say it was right about that, Dumbledore said regretfully. We tried everything, Mr. Black, to break through the wards ourselves. We were able to dismantle the concealing spells and most of the defensive measures, but the magic supporting the passageway itself was impenetrable. Snape scoffed. The founders built this castle. It answers only to them, and their descendants. Thank you for being there. In any case, Rigel said, your presence, and your phoenix, saved my life. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled a bit over his spectacles. Now don't get any silly ideas about life debts, Mr. Black. It is a phoenix's nature to heal, and foes will not accept anything more than thanks for doing what comes naturally to him. Thank you, she told the bird again, truly. Yes, yes, Snape said impatiently. You said the construct was relaxed in the chamber. Did he reveal anything to you? Quite a bit, Rigel said, though not all of it made sense. It talked about changing the world, and told me a bit about its plans. It was going to possess me, kill Ginny, kill the basilisk, and emerge from the chamber a hero, making it seem like I'd defeated the snake and Ginny had tragically died in the crossfire when her basilisk went insane with bloodlust. Her basilisk? McGonagall said incredulously. Yes, Rigel grimaced. The construct was going to say that Ginny had acquired Parseltongue through a dark ritual, and that she was working for the headmaster, petrifying students so that he could save the school at the last moment to look like a hero. You see what I meant about it being a bit mad? Who would ever believe such nonsense? McGonagall asked. She paused, thought a moment, then sighed. Never mind. I know exactly the sort of people who would believe such a thing. It killed the basilisk first, Rigel said softly, wincing as she remembered, because it wasn't sure it could control it as effectively if it switched hosts first. It was awful. The construct didn't use a wand or anything. It just ordered the basilisk to bite itself. The snake was so confused. It was in pain, but it just kept hurting itself because its master told it to. The professors all had sickened looks on their faces, and Ginny was paler than a ghost. McGonagall clenched her hand in her robes and said, "What cowardice! To slay a sentient creature in such a way. This is what happens when wizards don't take responsibility for their magic." Snape spat. "Such a thing should never have been born. A construct, no matter how complex, can never equal a wizard's will, can never be worthy of having a wizard's gifts bestowed upon it." Once the basilisk was dead, Rigel continued, "It broke off a fang to stab Ginny's body with. Once she was dying, it would have moved to possess me. I told him not to kill Ginny yet, pointing out that it didn't know for sure that it could possess me at all." "Your occlumency shields are not that powerful," Snape said, frowning. "It didn't know that," Rigel said. "I may have taunted it, as well." Dumbledore chuckled a bit, but Snape did not look nearly so amused. "Reckless child," the potions master said, "you could have angered him to violence." "It had already said it didn't want to kill me," Rigel said. "You'd already noted it was mad," Snape returned. Rigel grimaced. "In any case, it left Ginny's body and moved to possess mine instead. I distracted it with what little occlumency I am able to perform, and left my mind to go to Ginny's instead, once it became clear that the construct still had access to Ginny's magic even in my head." "You abandoned your own mind to help Miss Weasley." McGonagall's eyes were bright as she looked at her. "You brave boy." "A true hero," Dumbledore said, smiling benevolently. "It was the only logical thing to do," Rigel felt compelled to point out. "I couldn't get the construct out of my mind while he had access to Ginny's power, so by saving her I could save myself." Ginny narrowed her eyes. "Don't make it sound like you didn't do me any favors. You could have fought him off with your own magic, if you'd tried." Rigel wasn't sure that was true, at least as long as the construct had access to Ginny's magic, but she didn't want to argue with someone so pale and shaky looking. "When I got to Ginny's mind. Using a similar method to the way you accessed the children affected by the sleeping sickness, I suppose." Dumbledore interrupted genially. "Yes," Rigel said, "I didn't want the construct to guess what I was doing, and I believe it had erected occlumency shields in Ginny's mind by then in any case. When I got to Ginny's mindscape, I found her trapped in a cage of pure mental magic. It seemed to be preventing her from accessing her core. That is a common method used on psychiatric patients when their condition causes them to perform dangerous accidental magic," McGonagall said, distaste on her face at the thought of anyone who wasn't a mind healer using such a method to take someone's magic away. "It was easy enough to destroy, from the outside," Rigel said. "With Ginny free to take back her mind, I returned to my own. The construct was virtually powerless without a magical core to utilize, and it was quickly driven out of my head as well." "How, in the course of those events, were you stabbed by a basilisk?" Snape asked. "For that matter, none of your injuries have been accounted for." Rigel sighed. "The construct didn't have enough power to possess Ginny or I, as we were both consciously resisting, but there was another mind in the chamber that put up no resistance." "The basilisk's. Can you possess a dead thing?" McGonagall looked horrified. "Only its body," Dumbledore said gravely. "The basilisk's magic would have left with its demise, but the mental mechanisms remain in the physical brain. Possession is difficult to mentally conceptualize, but it is in large part a physical act. If there is no magic and no resident will to protect the mind from outside control, it succumbs quickly to foreign influence. The construct would have had physical control over the basilisk's form, recreating the physical impulses that control muscle, bone, and sinew." "That sounds like what it did," Rigel agreed. "The eyes weren't able to kill or petrify anymore, but the body moved as the construct commanded. When we realized where the construct was now housed, I made Ginny run to get help while I distracted it." "You rely overly much on distraction as a survival technique," Snape growled. "It is time you learned how to truly protect yourself." Rigel nodded. "At the time, though, it was the best option. The basilisk's magic was gone, but it was still big and poisonous. I ran, mostly, while Ginny fetched help, but in the end it caught me. I had gotten hold of the fang the construct was going to use on Ginny earlier, and while I had the chance, I stabbed the basilisk in the eye, and drove the tooth into its brain. I tried to destroy as much of the brain as I could, so that the construct would be forced to abandon its host." "But how were you stabbed?" Ginny asked, frowning. Rigel considered lying. It wouldn't help anyone to know that she'd tried to kill herself. Oh no you don't, Snape said sharply, do not contemplate lying to us. I will read your memories myself if I deem it necessary. Severus. McGonagall cried, he's just a boy. Mr. Black will not lie, Dumbledore said quietly, will you, my boy? Rigel looked away, those soft blue eyes, feeling dissected beneath their gaze, and couldn't bring herself to make anything up. I was out of magic, Rigel admitted, my ribs were making it hard to breathe, and I was going to pass out soon. The construct was waiting for me to faint, so it could possess me while I was unconscious, unable to stop it. I couldn't let it have my mind. My magic. Don't you see? It might have fooled everyone. What if it had gone to my home? Hurt my family? I didn't know if Ginny would be able to find anyone in time. It was the only way. You stabbed yourself, McGonagall's breath hitched in her throat. Snape's face was dark with rage, you nearly killed. That was the point, Rigel snapped. She took a deep breath, anyway, you all know what happened next. The construct fled, I don't know where. You found me, and here we are. Indeed, Dumbledore said, here we all are, safe and sound, and unpossessed, thanks to you, Mr. Black. Ginny shall be rewarded for her courage as well, of course. Dumbledore inclined his head cheerfully, yes, well done the both of you. Rewarded. Ginny shook her head slowly, I should be punished. I let that thing control me for so long. My dear, no one expects a first year to fight off the influence of an evil magical artifact, McGonagall said gently, this was not your fault, Miss Weasley. Please remember that. Indeed, no one can be punished for events beyond their control, Dumbledore said, but rewarded for the strength of character they show when terrible events occur around them. That is another matter entirely. Ginny and Rigel exchanged a troubled glance. Neither particularly wanted something to remember this night by, if they had a choice. Come, ask anything of me, Dumbledore said, smiling fully now. Rigel has no idea how he could be so pleased when all she felt was fatigued, mentally, physically, and emotionally. We don't want anything, Rigel said politely, accepting the look of thanks Ginny sent her with a small nod, our lives are enough reward, I think. A school award. Dumbledore suggested, a plaque in the trophy room, perhaps. Rigel grimaced. She definitely didn't want an award to Archerus Rigel Black hanging around the school. The less Rigel Black left behind the better. We'd rather put it behind us, Sir, Ginny said quietly. Dumbledore peered at them indulgently, I understand the impulse, my dear, but I'm afraid I cannot allow you to leave this room until you ask a reward of me. Rigel and Ginny stared at him, incredulous. McGonagall spoke, Albus, surely this can wait until they've rested. Dumbledore reached into a dish on his desk and plucked out a lemon drop to suck on before answering, putting off the good to dwell on the bad is never wise. It makes for fretful dreams and wakeful starts. Better to end on a positive note, a balm for the spirit, as it were. What are we supposed to ask for? Ginny said tentatively. House points, Dumbledore suggested, ignoring the annoyed looks McGonagall and Snape sent him for that, to become a prefect in your 5th year. More annoyed looks from the heads of house, don't be so cross, both would make excellent prefects, I'm sure. No. What do you want, then? If it is not too bold for an old man to say, what is within my power to bestow is not inconsiderable. Ginny hesitated, then said, would you withhold information about my possession? I know people will want to know what happened, but could you please just tell them someone was possessed, and not say who? I don't want people to hate me, for the petrifactions, I mean. Dumbledore's eyes softened, Miss Weasley, I would do that in any case. Ask something else. Ginny thought, then her eyes hardened, I want to learn occlumency. Proper occlumency, so that this never happens to me again. McGonagall sent her an approving look, though Dumbledore looked slightly taken aback at the request. That can be done, Dumbledore said slowly, I will arrange for a mind healer to visit your home over the summer, several times a week, to begin tutoring you in the art. These visits can continue during the school year, after classes, of course, if you still desire it. Ginny smiled, the first true smile Rigel had seen on her face in a while. Maybe Dumbledore was onto something with his insistence on rewards. Thank you, Ginny said fervently, thank you so much. Thank you, Miss Weasley, Dumbledore smiled, and you, Mr. Black. What do you desire? Rigel couldn't think of anything she wanted from the headmaster, really. Except, perhaps. Can I help harvest the basilisk? Dumbledore blinked at her, as did McGonagall and Ginny. Snape smirked. Harvest it? Ginny asked, wrinkling her nose. Basilisks are extremely rare, Rigel said. It would be a great opportunity to learn how to properly make use of its parts. Dumbledore smiled. Due to the part you played in its defeat, that right would be yours in any case. Is there nothing else you would ask of me? Rigel blinked, thinking it over. This was an opportunity she hadn't asked for, but an opportunity nonetheless. What did she want? Or need, for that matter? Does it have to be of you, headmaster? She asked, flicking her eyes toward Snape. Her head of house narrowed his eyes at her, but with a glance at the headmaster, inclined his head. Ask, Snape commanded. I know you only asked me to assist you this semester because you were saving your reserves, Rigel said, but may I continue to assist you until the term concludes? It has been an excellent opportunity to learn. Snape raised an eyebrow, though he inclined his head. Rigel thanked him sincerely. McGonagall snorted. A Gryffindor and a Slytherin go into the Chamber of Secrets, and 2 Ravenclaws emerge. We must be doing something right, Dumbledore said, smiling, when students consider learning to be the greatest of rewards. Rigel didn't know about the greatest of rewards, but knowledge was always the most practical. -0. HP. -0. She was taken to the hospital wing after Dumbledore released them. Madame Pomfrey declared her perfectly healthy, though she recommended Rigel rest in the hospital wing for a few days to recover her strength. She declined, and said goodbye to Ginny, who had also fervently denied the need for a stay under Madame Pomfrey's watchful eyes. McGonagall would escort Ginny back to her common room, and Snape would do the same for Rigel. They walked silently through the halls, down the stairs to the dungeons, and were almost to the common room when Snape spoke. You could have asked for an apprenticeship. Rigel turned to look tiredly up at him. What? You could have asked anything of me, Snape elaborated. An apprenticeship when you're older, a recommendation to the guild on your mastery application. You would have been smart to secure such things now, but instead you ask something you know I would have allowed you for its own sake. Why? Rigel blinked with feigned dismay. So you won't give me a recommendation for my application? Snape scowled at her. I am out of patience for the next fortnight, Mr. Black. Answer my question. Rigel scowled back up at him. I don't ask for things I am perfectly capable of earning myself, sir. It would be as bad as buying a place in the guild. Snape smirked down at her, and that attitude is the only reason I would consider recommending you for the guild, someday, he added, frowning repressively at her pleased expression. Rigel nodded seriously. Of course, sir. They reached the common room and Snape rapped sharply on the wall. Of course, Rigel thought, they must have locked down the school when they found 2 students missing. Selwyn's voice came crackling through the communication spell. Password. Moonstone, Snape said. The wall slid open, and they stepped into the common room. There were a surprising number of people still awake, considering it was close to 4 in the morning. Snape stepped forward to make an announcement, and Rigel slid away to join the crowd of students, looking for a head of platinum blonde among them. The basilisk is dead, Snape said bluntly as the students quieted to hear him. The curfew will be lifted tomorrow. Classes are cancelled for 2 days, after which the regular schedule will be resumed. The petrified students will be restored as soon as time permits. Find your beds, and sleep as long as necessary. Breakfast will be served until 11 tomorrow. Good night. The Slytherins began murmuring as soon as their head of house swept out of the common room, and the most popular conversation topic was her. She avoided the eyes of her housemates as she shifted through the students, looking for her friend, and ignored the whispers that followed her progress through the room. Wasn't Black kidnapped? Snape didn't say. Why isn't he petrified? Maybe he did it. Maybe he killed it. He probably. Rigel. Theo turned up at Rigel's elbow and steered her toward their dorm. Draco is in our room. He left after some idiot said you'd probably been killed if it was taking Snape so long to deal with it. Rigel frowned and walked a bit faster. Blaise showed up and held Theo back as Rigel continued down the second-year hallway alone. Let him have a moment, she heard Blaze say quietly. If I'm not much mistaken, he's earned it. She left the noise of the common room behind and entered her dormitory with relief. She was so tired. She spotted Draco sitting on the edge of his bed closest to hers, feet on the floor and head in his hands. He looked up when she stepped closer, and his eyes were rimmed with red, as though he hadn't blinked for too long an interval. He stared at her without saying anything, and Rigel sat down on the bed next to him, content to be silent for a moment after all the talking she had done that night. She just wanted the world to be quiet. -0. DM. -0. Draco had never been more worried in his life. He wasn't pacing the floor, demanding answers, pulling at his hair, or doing any of the things he had always imagined very worried people did. In fact, he felt quite numb. He felt as though letting any emotion leak through at all would break his control entirely, and so he sat in the common room, waiting, and when one too many loud-mouthed snakes began to test his tightly reined control, he got up, walked into his dorm room, and sat on the bed in silence, waiting for the numbness to go away. Waiting until it was safe to let himself feel again. Before that happened, Rigel came back. Draco stared as his friend walked quietly over to his bed and sat down beside him. Rigel didn't stare back, instead looking with a blank face at the hangings Draco had pulled around Rigel's bed when he grew tired of seeing it empty. All the questions Draco had thought he would ask died in his throat at that blank look on his friend's face. Draco knew what Rigel's usual blank expression looked like, and this wasn't it. Rigel wasn't studiously blank, carefully blank, or even deliberately infuriatingly blank. He was eerily blank. As blank and numb as Draco himself felt, as though he had become an empty shell. Draco wondered what had happened to drain his friend so, leaving behind only empty blankness, and then he wondered what it would take to wipe that lost expression off of his face. Rigel sighed, so deep and weary it made something in Draco wither to hear it. His friend slowly tilted sideways, and rested his head on Draco's shoulder. Draco immediately froze, in case movement startled Rigel into drawing back. It would be so easy to relax now, to think that everything was all right and just let go, but he clung to his control, kept hold of it for Rigel's sake, who seemed brittle and fragile, and a million other things that Draco had always thought good Slytherins were not supposed to ever be. Rigel breathed so slowly and deeply, Draco thought he had gone to sleep, until he said, "I'm tired. Can we talk about it tomorrow? Please?" The last he said on a whisper, and Draco felt his friend begin to tremble slightly against his shoulder. Draco put his arm around Rigel carefully, because even though Rigel was smart and driven and strong and independent, sometimes Draco thought he really needed someone to take care of him. He almost didn't believe it was Rigel when his friend shuddered and slumped against his side, but he didn't let go. He wouldn't let go until Rigel needed him to. "Tomorrow is soon enough," Draco said quietly, "but if you don't want to, you don't have to ever talk about it." He wasn't lying, either, when he said that. Even though he was burning slowly with curiosity, even though he wanted a list of the things that had made Rigel Black tremble like a leaf, so that he could find and hurt every single one of them, Draco would wait until Rigel was strong enough to explain things, even if he had to wait forever. To his utter shock, Rigel began to cry. Draco didn't realize what it was at first. The shaking got more prominent, and then there was heat and wetness on his shoulder, and then Rigel was apologizing and rubbing at his face furiously. Draco shook his head and fished a handkerchief out of his pocket. Rigel took it, and the white linen came away from Rigel's face streaked brown and red. It was then that Draco realized how utterly dirty Rigel was. He was covered in grime, slime, and something that looked horribly like blood, and made Draco want to pry Rigel's sleeves up and examine him for wounds. He stifled the urge, since he knew Uncle Severus would not allow Rigel to come back to the dorms without seeing Pomfrey first, but he wondered why the healer had not given Rigel different robes to change into. Then again, she probably had, because it would be just like Rigel to refuse to change his clothes in the hospital wing. He was extremely sensitive about his condition, which made it all the more unsettling that he acquiesced so easily to Draco's careful affection. "I'm sorry," Rigel said again, gesturing to Draco's handkerchief, "It's been a long night, and I'm sure you've been worried sick, and I've mucked up your bed, and started weeping like a Hufflepuff, and I'm just so tired." "You should sleep," then Draco said. He didn't want to point a wand at someone who'd clearly just been through something awful, so he said, use a cleaning charm on yourself for now, and you can shower properly in the morning. Don't worry about anything else tonight. Just go to bed. Rigel looked over at him with a pitiful twist to his mouth. Can't. My core's nearly empty. Draco felt his gut clench at that. Rigel Black, out of magic. All the scenarios he imagined Rigel might have been through just became several degrees of terrifying worse. He took his own wand out slowly, and kept it pointed away from Rigel's face or heart as he cast the spell. Rigel's robes became noticeably stiffer, but much better smelling, as well. With most of the serious crime gone, Draco helped his friend open his hangings and climb into bed. They each took off one of Rigel's shoes, and a moment later Rigel was curled up on his side, fast asleep. Draco didn't know how long he stood there, making sure Rigel was real, really there, really alive, really him, but eventually Blaze and Theo came quietly in to find their own beds. Is he okay? Theo asked nervously, fidgeting with his sleeves as he looked worriedly at Rigel's sleeping form. Draco turned away from watching his friend, and felt the jealous grip his mind had kept on his control slowly begin to ease. He will be. Draco would make sure of it. -0. HP. -0. When Rigel awoke the next morning, the first thing she did was take a shower. The disgust she felt for herself after crying in front of Draco the night before was complemented by the disgust she felt after realizing she still had bloodstains on her sleeves. She took what was possibly the longest shower of her life, and when she came out the bathroom was barely visible through the steam. She felt human, though, so she didn't mind that her skin turned bright pink from the heat and her fingertips wrinkled in protest of their long soak. When she emerged, steam rolling out into the room along with her, Blaze raised an eyebrow in her direction and Theo said, "About time. We thought you were trying flood the place or something." "I had basilisk brains under my fingernails," Rigel said. "Really?" Theo wrinkled his nose. "Gross. And kind of cool." Draco rolled his eyes at Theo and stood by Rigel's trunk while she ran a brush through her short hair. "We have the day off. Want to visit Pansy?" "Yes," Rigel said, "but I have to do something with Professor Snape first." "What?" Draco frowned. "You should at least take one day off, Rigel. After last night." "It's about last night," Rigel said, slipping on her shoes, which she noticed with pleasure had been cleaned by the house elves while she slept. She'd have to thank them, later. "It can't wait?" Blaze asked. "No," Rigel shook her head, "I'll be back this afternoon, though." As she left the dorm, she pretended she didn't hear Theo ask quietly, "Is he just going to pretend he's fine?" She was fine. What was there not to be fine about, after all? She was fine, Ginny was fine, everything was just fine. She made her way through the dungeon slowly. It was strange to see students wandering freely through the halls once more, but wonderful, too. She reached Snape's office and knocked with a polite amount of pressure. The door swung open at Snape's. "Enter." Her head of house looked at her with veiled incredulity for a moment. "Yes, Mr. Black," he said eventually, "what brings you to my office in the middle of the morning, when you ought to be resting in your dorm as per Madame Pomfrey's emphatic insistence?" "Grown tired of your friends' acclaim so quickly," he added sardonically. "I haven't really talked to them about it," Riddle said quietly. Snape looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "You should." "I know," Rigel nodded. There was a beat of silence, in which Snape sighed, then said, "For what did you come, Mr. Black?" "Since we have no class today, I thought we could get the basilisk dealt with," Rigel said. "Get the," Snape cursed, "foolish boy, you are not returning to that chamber now." "It has to be now," Rigel said firmly. "No," Snape said, equally firm, "you have yet to fully process." "That's why it has to be now," Rigel said quickly. "If I think too much, I won't want to." "Then you shouldn't," Snape snapped. "I have to," Rigel disagreed. "The basilisk will rot soon." "Let it," Snape bit out. "Your mental state is more important than a handful of potion ingredients, no matter how valuable the lesson in dissection practice is." Rigel shook her head slowly. "Thank you for your concern, sir, but you know that isn't true." "A basilisk, Professor. 50 feet at least. How many scales is that?" 1,000. With those scales, you could brew 100 different protection potions. With its tongue, You could brew Mordred's breath for the first time in 3 decades. Where did you hear about that potion? Snape scowled. In a book in the Black Family Library, Rigel said honestly, and if you don't go with me to harvest the basilisk, I'll go by myself, and brew anything I want with its parts in my father's basement. Don't you threaten me, boy, Snape said sharply. How long since St. Mungo's had enough ground basilisk bones to supply the children's ward with the painless alternative to Skelegro that Rachnoy invented in 1924? Rigel pressed. The guild's poison analysts could do wonders with a few vials of basilisk venom, and there's an eye, Professor, an untouched basilisk eye. She could sense Snape struggling with her arguments, though his face didn't show it. Be that as it may, he began, but she didn't let him refuse again. I watched it die, Professor, she said, thrashing and screaming, for no reason but a bit of magic gone mad. Its death was awful and unfair, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. There's good that can come of this, too. It took a great amount of effort to force the necessary words out, because they didn't mesh with the mantra of everything's fine playing on stubborn relay through her head. I need there to be something good in all of this. Please, sir. Snape relented, though he made no move to conceal his displeasure with the situation. At Snape's insistence, she waited while he contacted the headmaster, Professor Flitwick, and several house elves to assist in the project. She guessed Flitwick was there as a charms master, in case they found something unexpected in the chamber, and she supposed Dumbledore had a right to come as well, as it was his school, and therefore his responsibility to see to any dead monsters lying about. Still, it took longer than anticipated to assemble everyone, not to mention the bevy of tools and supplied Snape, with the help of the house elves, gathered for their use. By the time they reached Myrtle's bathroom, it was noon. Snape insisted Rigel eat 2 sandwiches that the house elves produced and also drink a nerve relaxer, a potion commonly administered to people after a particularly traumatic experience, when the healer suspected they may be a danger to themselves or others. Rigel scowled at Snape as she drank it, but did feel considerably more mellow afterwards. Snape only then allowed her to open the chamber. The drop looked as daunting as it had the night before, but now that she knew it to be an illusion of folded space, she wasn't worried about jumping in. Snape had other ideas, however, and with a silent spell produced a rope from the end of his wand, which wrapped around Rigel's waist tightly. With careful direction from his wand, the other end of the rope attached itself to a nearby sink. Snape nodded to Dumbledore, who gracefully twirled his wand at her in turn. Rigel was levitated gently into the passage, and she reflected that having fully grown wizards around certainly did make a lot of things easier. Before she touched lightly down on the chamber floor, Flitwick dropped quickly through the passage beside her, landing in a jeweler's crouch as he surveyed their gloomy surroundings. Not as glamorous as I imagined, he said lightly after checking for danger on all sides. I suppose I owe Minerva a shot of fire Uhisky, or butterbeer, that is. He coughed squeakily and smiled embarrassedly up at Rigel with good enough humor. Rigel supposed Flitwick hadn't entered the chamber the night before. Perhaps he'd been guarding the passage from the other end while Dumbledore, Snape, and McGonagall went through. It was a good idea to leave at least one head of house outside the chamber, in case it had been an elaborate trap. Snape and Dumbledore joined them soon after, along with the house elves, who floated down like fairies under some magic of their own making. It's this way, Rigel said, in case they didn't remember, they'd been following Ginny, after all. They set out at an easy pace, Dumbledore humming as he walked, and Rigel couldn't help but feel a sense of vertigo as her memories, colored by fear and confusion, clashed soundly with the present. Then again, that feeling might have been a result of the nerve relaxer. When they reached the chamber hall and approached the basilisk's corpse, both Snape and Flitwick sucked in deep breaths. Rigel wondered if Snape had been too preoccupied last night to really see the great snake. He was seeing it now, though, as they circled around to its head. His eyes took in the basilisk's length and girth with a calculating glint. Rigel swallowed as she gazed down at it. She had felt too removed, walking through the chamber clean and healthy, but the night before came rushing back, memories flashing like wand sparks across the inside of her eyelids every time she blinked. All she could do was stare at the dead basilisk, whose name, if she had one, Rigel had never learned. It's killed before, she reminded herself sternly. It was half mad by the end. It's better this way. But it wasn't, not really, because how could death ever be better than life? The hall seems safe enough, Flitwick said, returning to their group after surveying the room, though that statue on the far end is more than it seems, I dare say. It's a passage, Rigel said, it opens to Parcel Tongue. Well, if you don't mind, Mr. Black, the headmaster and I will do a bit of exploring while you and Professor Snape get to work, Flitwick said, looking a bit excited at the prospect. Rigel cast her mind back to what the construct had said the night before, speak to me, Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four. The stone mouth opened in a gaping way, which gave Laser Slytherin's head an odd, gasping look, and the headmaster set off with the head of Ravenclaw to see what they could find. Rigel turned to Snape, how do we begin? With the head, Snape said bluntly, I will deal with the iron tongue, and for Laser's sake don't touch the teeth. First, I will show you how to peel off scales without damaging their integrity. Watch closely. Snape took out a tool that looked like a small chisel, but with a little curl to the edge that acted a bit like a very delicate pry bar. He showed her how it would be futile to attempt to pry loose scales from the torso right away, because they overlapped in a way that prevented them. Instead, they began at the underside of the jaw, where the softest and loosest scales were, and started the slow process of detaching the scales one by one from the fleshy skin beneath. Once one scale was gone, it was easier to pry free the one beside it, and so on. The house elves joined in with great industry, and soon they were making noticeable headway. As she worked, she pictured all the good these scales were going to do in the wizarding community. They would be used in old potions, new potions, medicines, experiments, and more. Basilisks had always been a rare breed, and so knowledge about their uses in potions and alchemy was as limited as the quantity of parts researchers could get their hands on. There was no telling what kind of information and insight might be gleaned from the scales alone. And slowly, over the next few hours, she began to feel a kind of peace settle into her heart. What happened to her had been horrible, but she could handle it, work through it, the same way she was working through the basilisk, a little bit at a time. A morbid analogy, but she was allowed a bit of morbidity as she dissected a creature she had watched die in agony just hours before. Where did you learn to do this? Rigel asked as she watched Snape carefully pry a fang loose from the root with a pair of tongs that must have been goblin steel, to stand up to basilisk venom. She doubted Snape had ever dissembled a basilisk for use before, but perhaps he had dealt with other large snakes. Dragons, he said, not sparing a glance. I studied in Asia during my apprenticeship, and was afforded the opportunity to work with several recently deceased Chinese fireballs. Rigel thought that made a great deal of sense, as the scales on the basilisk were closer to dragon scales than any snake she'd ever seen, as they were stiff and more like armor than skin. Who did you study under? Rigel asked, curious. Master Lou, Snape said, a touch of respect coloring his tone. It was strange to think that someone she so respected had a master of his own, but comforting, too. Maybe one day she would have pupils as well, and they would say they studied under Mistress Black, or rather, Potter, she mentally corrected herself with a sigh. What was he like? Rigel asked. She had never heard of a Master Lou, but perhaps his publications hadn't been widely circulated in England. To this day I have no idea, Snape said with a wry smirk that made him look twice as human as he usually did. He didn't speak a word of English, and every time I cast a translating charm he overpowered it and dissipated it. I tried learning Mandarin the Muggle way, only to find out he spoke a variation of the Wu dialect, though which one I never discovered. Eventually I stopped trying, and we spent the remaining 3 months in silence. Why did he refuse the translating spells? Rigel asked, amused at the thought of anyone refusing Snape anything. Snape didn't answer for a moment, then said, I believe he took explanations to be superfluous to learning. He taught by example, and if I wasn't quick enough to learn the first time, I cleaned up my ruined cauldron and he showed me again. I hated him at first, he recalled, almost self-deprecatingly. I didn't understand what he was teaching me until I returned home. What was he teaching you? Rigel asked. Obedience. Anticipation, Snape said, and intuition. The two things necessary to timely experimentation, and to anyone who desires to put ingredients into a cauldron without the restriction of a recipe to interrupt creativity. Free brewing. That's what they called it when a brewer put ingredients into a cauldron without knowing exactly what would happen. It was extremely dangerous, and although free brewers in general didn't live very long, it was said that their creations and contributions to the field were unmatched in ingenuity, usefulness, and sheer volume. They worked for a while longer, in silence until Rigel asked, I know the tongue, teeth, eyes, bones, venom, and scales all have uses, but is there anything else? Blood, Snape said, but it has to be drawn while the basilisk is living, or before it coagulates, so we won't be able to collect that. The flesh itself has no use that I know of, but the organs will all be of use, particularly the stomach, liver, heart, and brain. Rigel winced. The brain might not be salvageable. Snape gave her a long look over the head of the great snake. Yes, he said eventually, I have ascertained as much from my inspection of the ruined eye. Nevertheless, your question was which organs would be useful, was it not? Rigel nodded. Yes, Professor. Snape began his work on the tongue once more, but said, almost casually, have you decided how you are going to allocate these parts? Allocate them. Rigel said, the repetition of his words enough to convey confusion in itself. Indeed, Snape said slowly, lawfully speaking, the corpse belongs to you, as you were the primary instrument of its demise. Its remains are yours to do as you would. Rigel bit back a skull, and said flatly, the basilisk killed itself. It should be the headmaster's responsibility to determine the proper use of its remains, as it died on school grounds, under his jurisdiction. Snape's next words were heavily measured, as though each were a weight he placed judiciously on a thin sheet of ice. You have the right to defer such matters to his discretion, however, that may not be the most prudent course of action. Turning responsibility for the kill over to the headmaster on the grounds of his jurisdiction as headmaster also highlights his responsibility for the snake being in the school in the first place. A part of her wanted to agree that it was the headmaster's responsibility, and to say that she shouldn't have to turn over the kill like she was handing in an essay, but the more conscientious part of her knew what her professor meant. Her political role was complicated, to be blunt. Her father supported Dumbledore, ostensibly, though she was becoming more and more confused about which side of the line Sirius ideologies fell, but she had been semi-formally adopted by the Malfoys, and she was the heir of Black, traditionally a dark-aligned family, but had strong ties and reasons to support the light political factions. All this was ignoring her recently revealed Parseltongue abilities, the political ramifications of which she had yet to determine. For all of those reasons, it would put her in a delicate position were she to put the headmaster in the delicate position. I suppose, Rigel said carefully, due to the passageway folding space the way it does, this place could be considered outside of school grounds. Who knows how far underground we are, below the deepest cornerstones for the wards, I'm sure. Snape inclined his head fractionally, so Rigel went on, it's amazing that the headmaster was able to find me and save my life, even after I was removed from the school's protection. Indeed, Snape said wryly, all that is left is to decide how to distribute the spoils from your kill, Mr. Black. Would you like an armored breastcoat made of its scales, perhaps? Rigel scowled at the tastelessness such a thing would have demonstrated, but acquiesced to the necessity of addressing the problem at hand. I would like a small portion each of the scales, bones, and tongue set aside under preservation charms, to be given to me upon my passing the potions newt. Snape nodded his head shortly, a prudent idea. I would like 1/3 of the bones to be donated directly to St. Mungo's, half of the venom donated to the Potions Guild, and 1/2 of all remaining ingredients sold to the guild at a heavily discounted price as well. And the rest? Snape prompted when Rigel fell silent. Rigel tilted her chin stubbornly, the rest is yours. Snape scowled at her, you cannot. It's mine to allocate, is it not? Rigel asked. Within reason, Snape said. What could be more reasonable than giving potions ingredients to a potions master, she asked. It smacks of bribery, and therefore is unseemly, he said shortly. The Malfoys donate to the school all the time. If anyone asks, I'll be donating the rest of the ingredients to Hogwarts, as a token of my thanks to Dumbledore for his Phoenix's timely arrival. It would be only natural for the resident potions master to then assume responsibility for the ingredients, and I'll make sure that Dumbledore understands I wish the parts to leave with you, if you ever decide to change professions. Her professor took a frustrated breath in his nose, traced the stubborn set to her face, and let it out again, I will hold the ingredients until you come of age. You will use them as they deserve to be used, Rigel said firmly, research, experiment, innovate. It's what you're best at, and you're one of the greatest potions masters alive right now, and I'm not going to wait 5 years to argue with you again over what to do with these ingredients when they could help people now. If you'd stop being so stubbornly pieted about owning up to your ability and accepting what you deserve. Snape raised an eyebrow, and Rigel coughed somewhat uncomfortably, belatedly adding, "Sir," with as much respect as she could muster. She regretted snapping at her professor, but she didn't like the way he acted, as though she was trying to do something unreasonable when she was trying to do something meaningful. The basilisk's parts needed to go where they would do the most good, and to be kept out of hands who would use them for ill. The profits would be great on the open market, but it was too irresponsible an option. They would do the most good in the hands of St. Mungo's, the guild, and Professor Snape, whether he acknowledged it or not. She would almost think her head of house was embarrassed, but a person as talented in his field as Professor Snape quickly abandoned any naive shyness they'd had upon entering it. Then again, perhaps being tucked away in Hogwarts most of the year had something to do with it. The professors here were all at the top of their fields, and probably wouldn't have much more than professional esteem for their colleagues who specialized in other branches of magic. Perhaps no one ever did remind Professor Snape just how much his expertise was worth to the wizarding world. Well, Rigel would have to see about fixing that. The greatest potions master of their age could not afford to be blind to his own talents, nor could he be allowed to martyr himself out of a basilisk eye to the detriment of both the whole of magical academia and wizarding kind itself. Professor Snape knew when pressing would gain him nothing, at least, and he said merely, "It will be as you say, it seems. The funds from those ingredients the guild will be allowed to purchase will be deposited into an account that Gringotts will assist you in establishing before the summer is." No, Rigel broke in hastily. Aside from the obvious complications that establishing an account in her cousin's name herself would ensure, she didn't think she could bear to have what was essentially blood money in her pockets. In the same way, she didn't want to look at any piece of the basilisk until she had taken her newts, several years from now. Snape actually looked close to sighing as he said, "How would you like to allocate the profits, Mr. Black? Use them to hire competent tutors to any of the petrified victims who want to make up the schooling they lost while unconscious, including make-up exam fees if required. Then give all the rest to Ginny Weasley," Rigel said, "or her parents to hold in trust if you think she's too young. Ginny is the main victim in all of this. She deserves some sort of compensation for everything she went through." "The Weasleys will not accept it," Snape drawled. "Their pride will stay them, especially concerning an amount as exorbitant as the sale of basilisk parts is likely to produce, even considering the reduction in price and the fact that you will be essentially flooding a very small market." "Then make it anonymous and non-returnable," Rigel said, "or just hand it to Ginny in cash. She's considerable more practical than most Gryffindors. And use a bit of the money to get Myrtle whatever she wants for her toilet," she added, remembering her promise suddenly. "So be it," Snape said. Rigel supposed he probably thought her a fool, to give away gain for sentimentality, but he did not deny her the right to such sentiment, at least. They continued working for several hours, until all of the scales were harvested and the house elves, under Snape's supervision, began the delicate work of opening the basilisk's torso for organ removal. They heard scrapes across the hall, and turned to see Flitwick and Dumbledore climbing down from Sorlaser's gaping, stone mouth. "Was there anything left?" Snape asked, though his tone indicated his disdain for the possibility of such an occurrence. Flitwick shook his head sadly. "We found many rooms of empty cabinets. No doubt there was a wealth of knowledge here at some point, but it seems to have been long out of our reach, taken decades ago and likely scattered or lost. Or hidden," Rigel thought quietly. She didn't think much of wasting knowledge, no matter its origins, and no matter the temptation to keep it for oneself. In any case, the trip was certainly not a waste, Dumbledore said, his face looking pleasantly satisfied. "We discovered a passage from the basilisk's lair that likely leads to the Forbidden Forest, if the remains of Acromantulas were any indication." Snape's face paled slightly, and Flitwick said hastily, "No need for alarm. The passage is well warded, and likely keyed to the basilisk alone. Nevertheless, we will have a team of true ward masters come over the summer, and either link them to the school's wards, relegating them to the headmaster's purview, or else undo them entirely and seal off the chamber for good." Rigel wanted to ask how they'd get into the chamber without Parseltongue, then realized they'd likely rework the wards in Myrtle's bathroom first. "Severus," Dumbledore said, eyes twinkling, I hate to pull you away from this project, but I believe you will be needed shortly in the hospital wing, will you not? Snape cased Tempus, then inclined his head. Indeed. Mr. Black, you will assist the house elves in finishing up. They know what needs doing, and they will take care of the transportation as well. You may merely watch, and learn, unless you are prepared to leave now. Rigel shook her head. She thought if she saw the harvesting through to the finish she would have a better sense of closure. See that you don't skip dinner, Snape said curtly. I, too, have a few matters to see to this evening, Flitwick said apologetically, but what danger lurked here once appears to be gone now. Nevertheless, please remain with the house elves at all times. They will see to your safe return. Rigel gave her word, and watched the professors leave, going back to their respective schedules. Life really does just go on like it did before, Rigel thought with a sudden surge of panic. Was it going to be that easy, to forget it all? What was she doing, if not cutting up and partitioning out the memories, the guilt and the horror? As if she could ever give enough of it away. It had seemed like such a good idea, just get rid of it, be rid of it all, but now Rigel wasn't sure she wanted to forget. If she forgot it all, then what did it mean? How had she changed? What had she learned? She leant down and picked a scale out of one of the many filled buckets around the pungent corpse. It was a good size, a bit larger than her palm, and a deep, emerald green. She turned it over in her hand, thinking. It was excessively sentimental, but something told Rigel she needed this. Is that one being broken, young sir? A nearby house elf asked. Rigel shook her head absently. I was just wondering if I could put a small hole in it, with a sharp enough tool. The house elf shook her head rapidly. These scales is being hard, but brittle individually, without the great snake's magic. I see, Rigel said, a bit disappointedly. She could keep the scale in her pocket, but it would be easier to lose. Why is you wanting a hole? The elf asked curiously. I thought I might string a cord through it, so it would be harder to lose, Rigel explained. Minna can be making a hole, the elf said with certainty. House elves is very good at softening magic. Where is you wanting the hole? Rigel smiled at Minna. Can you change the hole shape by softening it? Could you make it into a circle? Minna took the scale and peered at it. If I is changing shape, it is getting much smaller, otherwise it is being too thin. About the size of a ring, then. Rigel held out her hand. Can you fit it to one of my fingers? Minna nodded vigorously in affirmation. I'd really appreciate it, Rigel said. How can I repay you? Minna shook her head as rapidly as she had just nodded it. No, 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 you is not giving me anything. I is not accepting. Please? Rigel asked. I won't feel right if you do it for nothing. Because you is Slytherin, Minna said with a snort that was close to derisive. Slytherins is always thinking they is not deserving things for free. That is being stupid. A gift is being made for accepting. Rigel raised an eyebrow, then thought of her previous assessment of Snape, and nodded in assent. Just, thank you then. Minna nodded decisively and let the scale rest in one palm while using the other to snap her fingers. The scale began rotating fast in her hand, then rose into the air and started folding in on itself, as if the edges were rolling toward the center, while at the same time the middle began to shrink back toward the edges. It became smaller, denser, and as its revolutions began to slow, Minna guided it with a spindly finger to Rigel's outstretched hand. Rigel splayed her fingers, and the ring twirled itself gracefully onto the middle finger of her left hand. With a final revolution it tightened to a comfortable size and settled. When you is growing, you is finding Minna, and Minna is loosening, the house elf said. She was eyeing the ring admiringly, a pleased smile on her face at the result of her work. Take one, Rigel said, gesturing to the bucket. You can make a ring for yourself, too. Minna frowned severely at Rigel, but Rigel narrowed her eyes just as stubbornly. A gift is made for accepting, she said, quirking her lips slyly. Minna hesitated, then said, it is not really being considered clothes. Of course not, Rigel said, it's an animal scale, made into an ornament. Minna nodded firmly once more, plucked a small scale from the bucket, and said, thank you. She snapped her fingers, and the scale adhered itself to the brown crop leash she was using as a belt, like a shiny, green buckle. They went back to work readily, and by the time they packed up the last of it and assigned several elves to the proper disposal of the unusable remains, Rigel's heart felt significantly lighter, not as though a weight had been lifted, exactly, but as though an awkward burden had settled into a more comfortable position, so that carrying it no longer made her feel off balance or unstable. Just as they left, Rigel had a sudden idea, and plucked one more scale from a bucket, pocketing it with a smile. The house elves were kind enough to clean her up and banish the stink from her robes, so Rigel headed straight from the chamber to the great hall. She was a bit early for dinner, which had been pushed back later than usual due to everyone having been up so late the night before. She didn't mind being early, though, as it meant there were very few people to stare at her as she sat down and began filling her plate, glad that her vegetarian diet meant she didn't have to pretend meat wasn't going to gross her out for the next few weeks. Blaze entered the great hall not long after Rigel started eating, but as soon as he spotted her, he sighed, turned around, and left. 10 minutes later, he returned with an exasperated Draco and an amused Millicent in tow. "I was looking everywhere for you," Draco said as soon as he sat down. "I said I'd be back later," Rigel said. "You said you'd be back this afternoon," Draco said. Rigel gave an apologetic shrug. She should probably feel much worse about making Draco worried when he'd probably been awake for hours worrying over her last night, but disassembling the basilisk was something she had to do, and feeling guilty for it wouldn't help her move on. "It took longer than I thought," she offered. "We can see Pansy tonight, okay?" "No need," Millicent said from next to them. They turned to see Millicent beaming across the hall. Rigel followed Millicent's gaze to see Pansy, awake and well, walking across the hall toward them. "Pans." Draco stood and helped Pansy sit next to Rigel before taking his seat at Rigel's other side once more. "It is good to see you recovered, Pan," Rigel said, smiling broadly. "Draco was extremely difficult in your absence." Pansy grinned with good humor. "He can be rather trying to manage by oneself." Draco spluttered, "Me? Who's the one who got himself kidnapped?" "I'm the one who needed Pansy's help controlling you." "Evidently you're both a loose ends without me," Pansy sighed with affected hopelessness, but with an eminently fond look in her eyes. Rigel and Draco exchanged a wry look. "Pretty much. No argument here." The three of them laughed, and it was almost like nothing had ever happened, except that people kept coming over to see Pansy and tell her how glad they were that she was back among them. If most of them sent Rigel weighty, sidelong looks as they left, well, at least they were tactfully silent. By the time dinner was in full swing, Pusey Rookwood, Rosier, Theo, and Selwyn had all joined their group, and Riel wondered vaguely when they'd begun to sit in the middle of the Slytherin table, rather than at the low end with the other first and second years. Neville came over at one point, and thanked Rigel shyly. "I didn't do anything," Rigel protested. "You should thank the headmaster." "The headmaster didn't come visit me while I was petrified," Neville said, "but you did. Madame Pomfrey told me. So, thanks." "You'd visit me," Rigel said simply. Fairister stopped by to very formally request Pansy's pardon. "I have failed in my duty as a prefect to protect you," he said solemnly. "I cannot ask your forgiveness, only promise to do better in the future." "It was not your mistake, but my own," Pansy said quietly. "I was foolish to think myself immune to danger. I see now that here at Hogwarts all peril is shared, and neither house nor name can build walls safe enough to hide behind. It is a lesson I will not soon forget," she added, her expression firm. "But no fault lies with you." Fairister's expression was pained. "So you say, but still I left you to face the beast alone." At the mention of the basilisk, Pansy's face paled noticeably, and Rosier sent Fairister off with a glare that would freeze helium. "Are you all right, Pansy?" Theo asked worriedly. "Fine," she said faintly, "just remembering. It must seem silly, having been so long for everyone else, but it's the last thing I remember before waking up just an hour or so ago." Rookwood sucked in a breath. "You saw?" "Yes," Pansy said, "not just the eyes like the others. I was facing a mirror, and I saw it come around behind me a second before it caught my gaze. It was huge." She turned searching eyes to Rigel. "I never imagined an animal could be that large. Except dragons, maybe. The head alone was as big as Mr. Hagrid. You'd better not have really challenged it to a duel, Rigel." Rigel choked slightly on her pumpkin juice. "Is that what people are saying happened?" "I most certainly didn't." "I knew that was too Gryffindor for your style," Theo said, then asked, Did you really outwit it with clever trickery? That's what the ravens are saying. The puffs think you won in a battle of endurance, Millicent added, and tired the basilisk out through sheer perseverance. And the snakes? Rigel asked, slightly amused. We know better than to make up wild, groundless stories, Draco said dismissively. Most of us, anyway, Blaze said into his soup. Are you going to tell anyone what really happened? Pusey asked bluntly. I heard the youngest Weasley was missing from the tower last night too, but she refuses to speak about it. People shouldn't bother Ginny about it, Rigel frowned. She was a victim like me, of course she doesn't want to talk about it. Don't call yourself that, Draco griped from beside her. How did you defeat the basilisk, though? It's not a secret, is it? Theo pressed. Rigel looked around at her friends and told the truth. It wasn't heroic or clever, or even very difficult. The basilisk killed itself. There was a moment of silence, after which Pusey snorted with disbelief. Seriously? That's the worst lie I've ever heard. Implausible at best. It's true, Rigel said, frowning slightly. I was kidnapped by the basilisk's master. I waited patiently, as anyone with half a brain would, and eventually the kidnapper made a mistake. His miscalculation resulted in the basilisk killing itself. Dumbledore arrived, saving my life. The kidnapper fled, and that's all there is to it. No one looked particularly credulous. Where was Ginny Weasley while your life needed saving? Blaze asked pointedly. She was kidnapped too, but while the kidnapper was distracted she escaped and fetched the headmaster. I owe her my life as well, for bringing timely help. I'm very grateful to have had so much help during last night's ordeal. Selwyn pinned her with a flat look. You know that no one believes a word you say anymore, right? I believe, Rigel Pansy said calmly. You're only saying that because he's going to tell you everything anyway, Pusey said. At least tell us who its master was. I haven't heard of anyone being expelled. Did Dumbledore not catch the perpetrator? It wasn't a student. It was just an evil man who infiltrated the school for his own reasons, and fled after his plans were foiled, Rigel said, trying to make that part of the story sound uninteresting. Where were you all day? Draco asked abruptly. Helping Professor Snape harvest the useful parts of the basilisk. Rigel said, more comfortable with the change of subject. You'd be surprised at all the things a basilisk is good for. There's scales, bones, tongue, venom, the eye especially will. Eye? Blaze said sharply, just the one. Rigel grimaced inwardly. The other was unfortunately destroyed when the basilisk died. When it killed itself, Blaze drawled, I suppose its tail poked its own eye out accidentally. Something like that, Rigel mumbled. Well, I for one am just glad you're unharmed, Rosia said. It must have been a close thing, for you to claim that the headmaster saved your life by arriving. I wonder how that could be if the basilisk killed itself already. Rigel narrowed her eyes. I was injured before the basilisk died. It was serious by the time the headmaster arrived. Mortally injured. Blaze pressed, because you don't have to give him a life debt if it wasn't certain mortal peril. Yes, Rigel snapped, I got scraped by one of its fangs, okay. I was dying, but the headmaster's phoenix saved me with its healing abilities, and before you ask, the headmaster declined a life debt on behalf of his familiar's behalf, so there is nothing but gratitude between the headmaster and I. Another silence, and then Pansy's face was buried in Rigel's shoulder, and the blonde girl's arms went around her torso. You were dying, she asked, stricken. Why, you really almost died. Oh, no, Pan. Rigel hugged Pansy back helplessly. Don't cry, I'm fine. It wasn't, it's really not. Oh, this is why I didn't want to talk about it. She looked reproachfully at the others around them. Can't you understand, it's not just some interesting story. It's not a game, and it isn't fun for me to talk about. It's not supposed to be fun, Rookwood said, it's supposed to be therapeutic. We want to know what happened so we can help you come to terms with it. Thank you, Rigel said, patting Pansy's hair absently, but there isn't any need. That's what this afternoon's project was for. It helped me come to terms with things, dealing with the aftermath, like cleaning up my mind after a tornado blew through. I already feel much better. There's no reason to. She was cut off by cry of alarm going around the hall, and it was only because her magic was still extremely depleted that it didn't lash out and break anything in response to the panic that welled up in her throat faster than she could register. She swallowed hard, and tried to force color back into her face as she looked around with the others for the source of the disturbance. Then Millicent said, "The food," and Rigel looked down to see something strange even for Hogwarts. The food on every table was scurrying around of its own accord. Not all of it was mobile, but a good third of their dinner scuttled off their plates and rolled along the table with remarkable industry, considering its previous passivity. Rigel watched her dinner roll bounce drunkenly off the edge of the table and sort of wobble across the flagstones, headed toward the head table. Students were beginning to stand up on their seats to get a clearer view as the food from the 4 house tables began congregating in the center of the space between the student tables and the head table. At first it seemed as though the food was just going to put itself in a pile on the floor, which would have been the most strangest and most pointless prank anyone had ever heard of, but then the mass of food began dividing into groups, 3 groups, to be exact. As the food separated, it became clear that it was being differentiated based on color. Rigel noticed then that while it had seemed as though a random assortment of foods from the tables had mobilized, in fact it was only green foods, tannish-brown foods, and red-orange foods. The green foods made up the largest group. Spinach, lettuce, cucumbers, parsley, green beans, avocados, and more, vegetables of all shapes and sizes, some cooked, some raw, all coalescing into a massive, "Oh, no." Rigel felt like smacking her head on the table, or maybe smacking the Weasley twins' heads into one another, but she was too transfixed at the spectacle to turn away. What were those two thinking? The green foods were taking on the shape of a giant snake, with raw pea pods for teeth and eyes of yellow-green apples, with 2 large tufts of broccoli sticking out the top of its head like horns. A smaller mass of food, tan and brown in color and consisting mostly of dinner rolls and cooked pieces of meat stuck together by mashed potatoes, was beginning to look distinctly human. A black cloth napkin from the Slytherin table wriggled out of the mix and perched itself on top of the foodman's head like hair. "Is that supposed to be Rigel?" Theo snickered. Rigel felt very much like groaning. The food Rigel bent down and picked up the third, much smaller group of food, the red and orange mix of peppers, carrots, and tomatoes that had stacked themselves into a long, stick-like shape. The food person held the food stick in guard position against the snake, and Rigel realized it was supposed to be a sword. "What nonsense," Draco muttered, one eye on Pansy to see how she was reacting. Their friend seemed fine, though, if a little disapproving of the spectacle. The masses of food began to do battle, leafy green snake against meaty brown man with his pepper-red sword. It was frankly disgusting. The food made sickeningly dull humps and splats where the shapes connected, and each blow flicked errant bits of food across the flagstones. 5 minutes of fighting later, it looked as though the food man was about to emerge victorious. He was poised with his sword held high, ready to strike the deciding blow, when the vegetable snake lashed out with sudden vigor and swallowed the meaty boy whole. Students all across the hall gasped and shouted with dismay. "No! What the bloody hell?" The professors had grim looks on their faces, and even Dumbledore looked gravely unamused. Pansy's hand found Rigel's elbow below the table and squeezed. A creaking noise made Rigel look back toward Draco to see him slowly squeezing his water goblet into scrap metal. His face was more angry than she'd ever seen it, angrier even than he'd been at her over the defense incident. She reached over and pried his hand loose from the dented metal. He clamped his hand around hers instead, and shot the Gryffindor table as dark look. "I'm going to murder those two," he growled. A gurgling sound drew their attention to the spectacle of food, which was apparently not yet finished. The snake was making weird writhing motions, as though it was going to be sick, and Ariel had the awful feeling she was about to watch a mushy food version of herself be vomited across the flagstones. The snake's stomach trembled, bulged, and then, in a flash of red, the food sword came erupting from the green beast's belly and sliced the snake in half. Green vegetables rolled everywhere, once again lifeless, and Meat Boy emerged from the green pile of edibles with a triumphant pose, brandishing the sword of peppers and carrots at anyone and anything that might step forward to challenge it. The food boy swept the whole a deep bow, and then it, too, dissembled into its constituent parts. People began applauding somewhat uncertainly, but it dies down quickly as the food once more began moving, though it didn't form shapes this time. Rather, the bits of now crushed vegetables, rolls, and the like began to spell words across the stones, more food spilling down from the tables in floods, so that food of all colors and kinds danced over one another into place. cunning wit and brave determination together can outmatch the greatest foe. When we stand and forfeit hesitation, evil will be dealt a mighty blow. No matter what our houses or our names, to every student Hogwarts is a home. As long as we have magic in our veins, within these walls ill will shall never roam. The message was read aloud across the hall, people muttering the words to themselves or shouting them to their neighbors. After a fair pause, the message fell apart, and the food assumed a final pattern, just 8 words all told. Thank you Rigel Black for protecting our school. Rigel felt her face burn without her permission, as all around the hall students began to applaud, whistle, and cheer loudly. She caught sight of Ginny Weasley, in between her perplexed-looking brothers, looking grimly satisfied, and she even saw Ernie Macmillan, previously one of the strongest voices in favor of her guilt, clapping slowly, a respectful look on his face. The professors were clapping too, Dumbledore once again smiling benignly, and when Snape lifted his goblet and nodded with something like open approval in her direction, Rigel had to clench Draco's hand very tightly indeed. -0. HP. -0. The end of the term passed quickly, the days blurring together as everyone scrambled to make up in classes what they hadn't learned for one reason or another. The professors were somewhat lenient due to the trying atmosphere the basilisk's reign brought with it, but the gaps of knowledge still needed filling in, and the time for packing up their belongings in preparation for returning home had, it seemed, sprung upon them with neither word nor warning. The last week of school found Rigel in her lab, which Snape had acceded to opening for her once more, preparing the next dose of modified polyjuice, which she really needed to think of a better name for. She had sent Sirius the wrong time for picking her up again. It would be obvious when he arrives at the platform, but there was nothing for it. She needed to take this dose after leaving her friends but before meeting her godfather. Archie would take his after getting off the plane, but before meeting the Potters at baggage check. She had already used the blending spell on she and Archie's most recently plucked hairs. It hadn't been as exhausting as she remembered it being, so maybe always draining her core was helping it build up stronger reserves. The modified polyjuice was moments away from being finished, and at that point she would keep one dose for herself, and mail the other, with the male blended hair, to Archie that night. Just as she was pouring the doses into their sealed vials, a knock came at the door. She hurriedly stored the doses in her bag and cleared the most incriminating ingredients, the lassoing flies and the boomslang skin, from the counter before brushing her bangs down in a nervous gesture and answering the door. To her immense relief, it wasn't Snape. Ginny Weasley stepped into the lab with an air of detached interest as she glanced about. I sort of remember being here, now she said, lifting a hand to push back her hair absently, but it's just flashes. Did I pull your hair? Rigel shrugged with affected nonchalance, determinedly not remembering the Cruciatus curse spilling from Ginny's lips in the dark. I don't remember, maybe she said, what can I help you with, Ginny? I don't need help, Ginny snapped. She rolled her eyes a moment later, and blew out a calming breath, sorry, but I'm so sick of people trying to be solicitous. It just ends up condescending. I understand, Rigel said, people think talking to them about things will help you get over them. That's just what they tell themselves, Ginny said sourly, really, people are just nosy. Does your mother know how cynical you are? Rigel asked, trying to lighten the mood. Ginny snorted, she positively despairs of me, but that's what she gets for giving me 6 brothers. They stood silently for a moment, then Rigel said, since you don't need help, what are you here for? Just to talk, Ginny said, can we sit? Rigel gestured toward a lab stool, taking one for herself as well, about that night. In a way, Ginny said. Her eyes drew sharp angles over Rigel's face. I want to know why you lied to Dumbledore that night. Rigel didn't blank her face completely, she was becoming a better Slytherin than that, but she maintained a politely confused expression. What do you mean? I told the truth. Not all of it, Ginny returned. I can remember bits and pieces from when I was possessed, and I remember Tom telling you that his whole name was Tom M. Riddle. Why didn't you tell the headmaster that Lord Riddle was behind everything? Are you in favor of the Sow Party? No, Rigel said simply, my aunt is a Muggle-born, and my cousin a half-blood. I support their rights in ways the Sow Party doesn't. I didn't tell Dumbledore what the construct said because I don't think the word of an insane magical object is enough proof to accuse a man of attempted murder, no matter who he is. Ginny narrowed her eyes. You're telling me you don't think Lord Riddle created that book? Rigel chose her words carefully. I think I've never read a law that strictly prohibits fashioning a magical artifact after oneself. That's what the Sorting Hat is, to some extent. Whoever made that book is not necessarily responsible for the magic degenerating out of control. Add to that, I'm not sure the book can be sure who created it, if it was even telling the truth about what it believes. It could have been designed to think it was created by Lord Riddle, who has been rather well known for some time, and who has never been proven to speak Parseltongue. I think there is too much uncertainty in the evidence, and I also think it would be unfair of me to pass along, thereby giving some credence to the ramblings of magic gone mad, particularly to the headmaster. He is a good man, but he is also Riddle's political opponent, and may be tempted to use these unfounded accusations against Lord Riddle before proof was established. Ginny raised her eyebrows. That all sounds very convincing, and even somewhat noble in a flinchingly hesitant sort of way, but I think you're afraid to anger Lord Riddle because you live in a dorm full of his supporters. I also think you mean to keep this knowledge to yourself as leverage, in case you need a large favor from someone with his kind of power at one time or another. Rigel opened her mouth to disagree, but Ginny held up a hand. I don't care about your motivations, though. I told you that I know more than you thought because I want you to appreciate the favor I'm doing you by collaborating the story you told Dumbledore. At Rigel's slightly apprehensive look, Ginny explained, you've said we have equal life debts, which cancel each other out, but you lied to Dumbledore for me, which is a debt of its own. I don't. You told Dumbledore I came into contact with the book and was possessed, Ginny said, but I remember Tom gloating to you about how willingly I let him into my head. I hate myself for that, Ginny spat quietly, and I never want anyone else to know. Your silence on the matter is worth a lot to me, more than just going along with your version of events could equal, so I'm going to tell you this, too. Lucius Malfoy gave me that diary. Rigel sucked in a breath. That was bad. Draco would be hurt dearly if his father was proved beyond a doubt to be connected to the basilisk, to Pansy's petrifaction. Are you certain? She breathed. Ginny nodded sharply. He dropped it into my cauldron in Diagon Alley. I didn't say anything because I was curious, and it seemed almost like an accident, so that he could deny the purposefulness of it easily, and then I thought it was such a great find, that he must not have known what it did, that he'd just thought it fitting for a Weasley to have a beaten-up old book. But it was him, and now that I know of Tom's connection to so, I know what Malfoy was after. I'm not threatening you, this is my other favor to you. Now you know Malfoy's involvement, and because Draco Malfoy is your friend you can do what you want with the information. I don't care. I just want to forget everything. After this deal I'm never going to think of it again. Rigel nodded slowly. Thank you, Ginny. I'll discover the truth for myself, and... Don't care, Ginny grimaced. Sorry, but just agree to never tell anyone my possession was anything but forced, and I'll agree with whatever you say happened that night, and no one will know of Malfoy's part in it unless you tell them. Agreed, Rigel said softly, feeling the weight of responsibility descend on her shoulders. It would be her duty, now, to confront Lord Riddle and Malfoy Sr., and decide what needed exposing and what to keep quiet for the sake of her friend. Ginny, contrariwise, looked as though she'd become several stones lighter. I'm going to go away as soon as exams are over, she said, a slight smile on her face, somewhere warm and quiet, and then I'll come back and begin my occlumency lessons. I think next year is going to be better. She laughed, and it was only a tiny bit bitter. It can't really be worse, can it? Rigel felt a pit harden in her gut at those words. Tempting fate never boded well. She smiled weakly and wished Ginny good luck before closing the door behind her. Rigel rested her head against the frame and breathed out a deep sigh, wondering when the world would grow less complicated, and wondering when she'd started accepting so many responsibilities, and wondering that she'd ever though she could come to Hogwarts and just brew potions. -0. HP. -0. Rigel finished packing the morning the train left for London. She'd been assigned a satisfying amount of summer work from Snape, sealed up her lab, collected Flint's summer assignments, mailed the other dose of modified polyjuice to Archie, along with the blended hair he'd need, and as such had only one last bit of business to conduct before boarding the train. To conduct it, she needed to find Selwyn. Pansy was saying goodbye to Rookwood and Rosier, the later of whom Rigel would be pleased to have a break from over the summer, and he'd become almost proprietary about her whereabouts after the incident in the chamber. Draco walked beside her as she looked for Selwyn's long, black hair among the throng, making small talk about all the things he had planned for the summer. After my birthday party, there will be more time for us to see one another, of course, he broke off, sniffed rather deliberately, then turned on his heel and walked in another direction. Rigel looked around for a pair of redheads, as the Weasley twins were the only thing Draco got that annoyed over lately. Fred appeared at her elbow a moment later, George sidling up to her other side moments later. I'm starting to think your boyfriend doesn't like us, George said sadly. He'll like you even less if he hears you call him that, Rigel said. He's still upset about that prank with all the food, you know. Fred and George shared an uncharacteristically dark look. We told you that wasn't us, Fred said flatly. We told everyone that wasn't us, George added morosely. I wonder why no one believed you, Rigel deadpanned. You believe us, don't you, pup? Fred bent his knees so that he could look up at her pleadingly. I believe you wouldn't give up credit for something so intricate unless you felt really horrible about it, Rigel said, so if this is just you feeling guilty, don't. I'm not offended. It was a clever bit of magic. We really didn't, Rigel, George said, shaking his head, and what's worse, we have no idea who did, except that they are good. Rigel shrugged, I believe you. Just don't ask me to convince Draco of it. We actually came to ask you something else, Fred said, perking up again. George slung an arm around her shoulder genially. Since a certain second year saved our baby sister's life, our mother has been twisting our ears. An impressive feat to accomplish through a letter, Fred put in. To get us to arrange a meeting, George grimaced, rubbing an ear in mock pain. It would mean a lot to our hearing if you agreed to come for a visit this summer so she can break your ribs thanking you. Rigel swallowed. I'm not sure I can. I have a lot to do this summer, work from Snape and all. Fred and George raised eyebrows at her. I'd be delighted, Rigel sighed, but please tell Mrs. Weasley that there's no need for any kind of thanks. Ginny saved my life, too. We shan't tell her anything of the sort, George grinned. But modesty does become you, pup. Fred ruffled her hair fondly, do keep at it. They took their leave, throwing a warning over their shoulders as they walked off. We'll be waiting for your owl. Or we'll be kidnapping you from your bed. Rigel absolutely wouldn't put it past them to get into contact with Sirius and organize a raid on Archie's bedroom. Sirius would think it was hilarious, until Archie had no idea what to say or do to fool the Weasley twins into thinking he was Rigel. She would put a visit to the Weasleys on her summer's mental list as well, and hope that she and Archie's capacity for cleverness hadn't run dry just yet. She continued her search, and eventually found Selwyn talking with a third-year Slytherin Rigel sort of recognized. The girl hugged Selwyn briefly, then ran off to join her friends on the platform. Rigel caught Selwyn's face soften in a half-fond smile an instant before the older girl turned and caught sight of Rigel coming toward her. Immediately, Selwyn coolly swept her hair back from her face and rolled her eyes. Even without the badge, people still come to bother me with their problems. She gestured dismissively at the empty place on her robes where the head girl badge had hung just yesterday. Rigel smiled inwardly, and pretended to believe that Selwyn wasn't going to miss Hogwarts at all. What are you going to do now? I have a job lined up at the Circle, Selwyn said with a shrug. Rigel vaguely recognized the name of one of the rune-related magazines Blaise was always perusing. I start next week. That's great, Rigel said, congratulations. Thanks, I guess, Selwyn said, so what do you want, Black? And before you answer, are you sure you can't save it for the next head girl? Rigel smiled slightly. I just came to apologize for everything I put you through, and all the times I didn't listen to your advice as carefully as I should have, and just everything. Sorry, Selwyn. Thanks for worrying about me, and going out of your way to help so often. Selwyn smirked. Who said anything about being worried? Do you know how much paperwork is involved if I lose a student on my watch? Mountains. It'd give even you nightmares, Black. Rigel frowned. What's that mean? Selwyn snorted softly. Right. You know they used to think I was emotionally dead until you got here. You raised the bar on untouchable, that's all I'm saying. Right, Rigel said. Well, I wanted to give this to you, as a token of my thanks for everything. She started fishing in her pockets for the third basilisk scale. I swear to Merlin if you've lost your wand again. Selwyn muttered darkly. Rigel did smile then. It's in the pocket by my hip, and probably always will be. Thanks Orlaser for that. Rigel finally found the scale mixed in with a few galleons and handed it over. I thought you could use it in your game with Rookwood. Selwyn took the palm-sized scale with a slightly surprised look on her face. You're just giving these away. Everyone says the blacks are mad, but, thank you. It might be a bit obvious where it came from, but Edmund will think it's great anyway. She tucked the scale securely into a breast pocket, and held out her hand to Rigel. I can't say it's been nice knowing you, Black, but it's certainly been unforgettable. I'm glad I met you, too, Rigel said. I'd offer to keep in touch, but... Yes, Selwyn laughed shortly, as if. Still, the wizarding world isn't that big, and Hogwarts doesn't last forever. I'll be around 5 years from now. That makes one of us, Rigel thought. She smiled politely, shook Selwyn's hand, and boarded the train as the last whistle sounded. 2 years down, 5 to go. -0. LV. -0. Far away, in a forest so thick the day meant nothing to its darkness, fraying magic wrapped in man seeming and trapped in the mind of a trembling asp curled up amidst the shadowy hollows of a great tree's roots and bided the time away patiently, regaining its strength, revising its plans, and reassuring itself that all was not for naught. One day, there would be a reckoning. -0 -0. -0. 0. End of Book 2.